He once saw a dark-skinned girl with a baby and recognized her as his granddaughter. The millionaire went to a poor neighborhood where an old trailer stood. He knocked on the door, and what happened inside changed everything. Subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching this video from. The grandfather clock in the hallway struck 8, with a hollow resonance that echoed through the cavernous rooms of the Larchmont estate. The chimes rolled slowly, like reminders of a time long past, swallowed in velvet drapes and heavy mahogany. Richard Lawrence sat alone at the long dining table, a single place setting before him, silver utensils gleaming in the chandelier's glow. The rest of the table, built to accommodate 20 guests, remained untouched, and untouched it had been for years. A glass of Cabernet rested beside his plate, half sipped, forgotten. He chewed without much thought, not even tasting the perfectly seared veal prepared by the chef who had worked for him since the Reagan administration. The meal, like most things in his life now, was mechanical. Necessary, perhaps, but not meaningful. At 78, Richard was a man of routine, one which insulated him from the changing world outside and the memories that lingered in the quiet. The dining room was deathly silent, save for the low murmur of a television screen flickering in the adjacent library. News anchors in neat suits spoke earnestly about markets, foreign affairs, and congressional deadlock. Richard wasn't really listening. He had already made his money, and the world's noise had become irrelevant. What mattered now was the silence that followed each headline, the slow realization that there was no one to share it with. After dinner, he pushed back his chair and walked the long corridor toward the study. His gait was measured, slightly stiff at the knees, a quiet reminder of the 2 hip replacements he'd endured over the past decade. The walls were lined with portraits, ancestral faces in oil, stoic men and tightly corseted women. He paused briefly by the last one on the right, a painting of himself in his 50s, dark-haired, square-jawed, flanked by his late wife Eleanor in a deep green dress. She had died 5 years ago of breast cancer, and Richard had not truly spoken to anyone since. The study was his sanctuary, paneled in oak, the scent of tobacco still clinging faintly to the armchairs despite his quitting years ago. The fireplace, cold tonight, had not been lit since Christmas. He lowered himself into the leather wingback and stared at the embers of memory that still glowed somewhere deep inside. A tumbler of scotch appeared moments later, delivered by a butler who had mastered the art of invisibility. Richard sipped, exhaled, and glanced at the far bookshelf, 3rd shelf from the top, behind the false row of law books. There was a box there. He hadn't opened it in nearly 30 years. The room fell into a deeper stillness as he rose, scotch in hand, and approached the shelf. With a practiced motion, he tugged at the spines of the books that weren't books at all, revealing the aged leather of a dust-covered box. He pulled it down carefully, as though it were sacred, and carried it to his desk. Its contents were unremarkable. Old photographs, letters, a faded program from his daughter's high school graduation. At the very bottom was a sealed envelope with his name in a handwriting he hadn't seen in decades. Elizabeth's handwriting. He stared at it for a long while, his heart pressing against his ribcage like a restless animal. She had sent this years ago, probably when she was already sick. He hadn't known she was sick. Or perhaps he had, and simply didn't want to know. He had told himself that she had made her bed, that she had chosen a life that disrespected their name, their legacy. She'd married a black man, an artist, no less, and left without apology. With trembling hands, he opened the letter. The paper was yellowed, but the ink still strong. "Dear Dad, I know it's been a long time, and you have every reason not to answer. I won't beg. I only want you to know that I have a daughter now. Her name is Naomi. She's beautiful and brilliant. She has your eyes, though they are darker, and your stubbornness. I think you would like her if you ever met her. I don't expect anything. I just wanted you to know I named her Lawrence. That's your name, too. I hope you're well. I hope you're not as alone as I imagine you are. Love, Elizabeth. His throat closed. The walls of the study seemed to lean in toward him, thick with the unsaid, the undone. Naomi, a name he had never spoken, a granddaughter he had never met. She would be, what, in her 20s now? A child when Elizabeth wrote this. And he hadn't even opened the envelope. It had waited in silence for him to be ready, and now, decades too late, here it was, the truth of his own legacy pressing down on him like judgment. He folded the letter and held it to his chest, eyes shut. That night, he didn't sleep. He wandered the halls of his mansion, moving from window to window like a ghost, peering into the darkness, into a life that had moved on without him. Outside, the world pulsed with neon and noise, but none of it reached him. His wealth, his power, his carefully curated empire, they had bought him solitude. They had silenced everything but the ticking of the clock, now growing louder with each passing hour. At dawn, he returned to the study, sat at the desk, and began to write in longhand. He wasn't sure what the letter would say. He wasn't even sure if she would read it, but it was the first time in years that he had something to say to anyone that wasn't a lawyer, a banker, or a board member. He signed his name simply, Richard. But before he could place the letter in an envelope, he paused. It wasn't enough. Words were no longer enough. Not now. Not after so many years of silence. He stood, gathered the letter, the box, and returned to the bookshelf. For a moment, he hesitated. Then he placed the letter back in the box and shut it. He didn't want Naomi's first impression of him to come in the form of a half-hearted apology scratched out in a moment of guilt. No. He would find her. He would look her in the eye and see for himself what had been lost, what had been thrown away in the name of pride and legacy. The day stretched ahead of him, filled not with meetings or appointments, but with something he hadn't felt in a very long time, purpose. He made a single phone call to his attorney. "I need a private investigator," he said, voice low, steady, "and I need him yesterday." The sun was rising now, and for the first time in years, Richard Lawrence was awake with it, not because of routine, but because of need. Something inside him had cracked open, something deeper than guilt. It was the stirrings of grief, of love long buried, and the sharp clarity that what he had mistaken for principle had in fact been fear. And now, in the stillness of morning, the old man began to face the past. The days that followed were curiously quiet in the Lawrence estate, though the silence had always been there, tucked between the ticking of the antique clocks and the muffled footsteps of domestic staff. But now it felt different. It was a listening kind of silence, an expectant hush like the world itself was holding its breath. Richard wandered the house more than usual, not in his usual restless manner, but with a distracted thoughtfulness. The letter from Elizabeth was still in his coat pocket, folded and unfolded so many times the edges had softened. He had not yet told anyone about it, not his lawyers, not even his long-trusted butler who had been with him since Elizabeth was a teenager. There was something sacred about the paper, the words written in her hand, something he wasn't yet ready to share. Every time he read her name and those few lines, something in his chest stirred. Not pain exactly. Not guilt alone either. Something more complicated. Something tender. He had not expected to find himself sitting in the sunroom that Thursday afternoon, the television on, a tray of untouched tea beside him. The channel had been left on from earlier that morning, a local news station cycling through predictable segments, the mayor's latest promises, school closures, traffic snarls. Richard stared at the screen without watching, his thoughts elsewhere. Then came a segment he hadn't anticipated. The anchor's voice softened. Tonight, we continue our series on working mothers living below the poverty line. Our reporter, Janine Parker, takes us inside one of the many communities facing economic hardship right here on the edge of the city. The footage shifted. It was a familiar backdrop, a trailer park on the industrial edge of town, the kind of place Richard had only ever driven past with windows rolled up. The camera showed rows of worn trailers, narrow paths of gravel, laundry lines sagging between cracked porches. A mother walked with a toddler in her arms, shielding her child from the sun with her own shadow. Then the screen lingered on one face. She was young, no more than mid-20s, her features striking yet tired. Her skin was the shade of rich mahogany, her eyes large and intelligent but dulled by fatigue. Her dark hair was tied back loosely, a sleeping infant resting against her chest in a cloth sling. She looked straight into the camera as the reporter approached. Richard leaned forward, squinting, something in his heart thudding unevenly. "My name's Naomi," the young woman said. "I work 2 jobs, sometimes 3. I don't get government help anymore because I make just over the threshold. Doesn't matter that I can't afford childcare or rent or gas. They told me I'd be fine. But I'm not." The name hit him like a slap. Naomi. The sound of it, the way she said it, confidently but without hope, echoed what Elizabeth had written. His hand went to his chest, fingers tightening over his silk waistcoat. Could it be? Could this woman be her? The reporter asked more questions. Naomi answered clearly without theatrics. She explained how she had applied to college once, years ago, but deferred because her mother had gotten sick. Then she got pregnant. Her partner had vanished not long after. She did what she had to, waitressing, cleaning offices at night, occasionally helping out in a neighbor's daycare for spare cash. She smiled once, faintly, when the baby stirred, but it faded as quickly as it came. "She looks just like her," Richard whispered, the words catching in his throat. There was no mistaking it now. The curve of her jaw, the shape of her mouth when she pronounced her vowels, Elizabeth's echo was etched into her face. Even her posture, the tilt of her shoulders reminded him of those early days when Elizabeth used to stand in the garden, talking to herself as she rehearsed piano pieces in her head. The segment ended, cut into a commercial for a local car dealership. Richard stared at the blank screen, blinking slowly. He rose with surprising speed for a man his age, crossed the room and rang for Bernard the butler. "Sir?" Bernard appeared in seconds, ever at attention. "Call Marcus Denton. Have him come to the house. Tell him I have a job for him." His voice was low, tense with urgency. "Yes, sir." Denton was his private attorney and handled matters with discretion. But more importantly, he had access to people who could find anyone, anywhere, quickly and without fanfare. Richard didn't want publicity. He didn't want gossip. He wanted answers. Within an hour, Denton arrived in a dark gray suit, briefcase in hand, as always. He found Richard standing in the study, the television paused on Naomi's face. Denton took one look at the screen and then at Richard, and said nothing. "She's mine," Richard said simply. "Her name is Naomi. I need to know everything." Denton, ever the professional, nodded. "I'll make some calls." "She lives in a trailer park. She has a child." Richard's voice cracked slightly. "She's my granddaughter." Denton only nodded again. No judgment, no questions. "You'll have a full report within 72 hours. Make it 48. "Yes, sir." Richard stood long after Denton left, the screen still paused. He studied every detail: the frayed edge of Naomi's sleeve, the baby's tiny hand curled against her collarbone, the crease between her eyebrows. His chest ached with a weight he didn't yet understand, only that it was heavy and old. He barely slept that night. Visions of Elizabeth haunted him, fragments of memories flashing unbidden, her dancing barefoot in the kitchen, arguing about curfews, the last time she stood in this house, suitcase in hand, defiant, proud, her eyes brimming with tears she refused to let fall. He had slammed the door after her. She had never returned. And now there was Naomi. The next morning, the report came sooner than expected. Denton returned with a dossier bound neatly in leather. Richard opened it at the breakfast table, pushing his untouched food aside. There were photographs: Naomi exiting a diner in her work uniform, walking home with groceries, playing with her child in a small patch of dirt beside her trailer. Her daughter, the report stated, was named Abigail. 18 months old. No father listed. Naomi had no criminal record, no college degree, 2 part-time jobs, and a past filled with hardship. Her mother's death from lymphoma when she was 19, a missed scholarship opportunity, a string of temporary shelters before she managed to secure the aging trailer she now called home. Richard read every word. "She's been alone for too long," he murmured. He dressed with purpose for the first time in months, not in his usual tailored monotony, but in something simpler: khakis, a plain white shirt, loafers, no cufflinks, no gold tie pin. As he looked at himself in the mirror, he saw a man trying to erase just a bit of who he had become, hoping to appear less like a ghost of power and more like a man, just a man. He asked for the driver to prepare the car but dismissed Bernard's suggestion to accompany him. This was something he had to do himself. The ride to the trailer park took less than an hour. The city blurred past his window, slowly unraveling into less manicured neighborhoods, buildings stripped of their polish, until finally the car turned down a narrow, cracked road where sagging electrical wires hung like tired arms. The trailer park was smaller than he had imagined, tightly packed, its fences rusted, its windows shielded with old curtains or cardboard. Children played barefoot near broken bicycles. The car pulled to a stop. Richard stepped out, the gravel crunching beneath his shoes. A few heads turned. He didn't fit here, and everyone knew it. He spotted the trailer from the photographs: a pale green door with peeling paint, the clothesline with baby garments, a tricycle resting against a dented aluminum wall. He walked slowly toward it. Then he knocked. There was a pause, a shuffle inside. The door creaked open. And there she was. Naomi looked at him blankly at first, confused. Then her gaze sharpened. Recognition dawned in slow, painful waves. "You," she said. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came. Her eyes narrowed. "I know who you are." The baby stirred in her arms, and then, without another word, she closed the door. He stood there, hand still lifted midair, breath caught in his throat. The weight in his chest had only just begun to settle in. Richard stood motionless on the gravel, hand still hovering in the air where the trailer door had been just moments ago. The wind tugged gently at the sleeves of his shirt, and somewhere behind him a dog barked. The sound sharp against the distant hum of traffic and the clatter of children's bicycles on pavement. He stared at the closed door. the shape of her face still lingering in his mind, so much like Elizabeth's, but hardened in ways his daughter's had never been. Her gaze had held no warmth, only cold recognition, a verdict without trial. He lowered his hand and stepped back from the narrow steps. For a moment, he considered knocking again, demanding conversation, but something in the finality of her expression had stopped him. This was not the boardroom. This was not a space where authority commanded obedience. Here, in this weathered place of tin walls and threadbare curtains, he was not Richard Lawrence the tycoon. He was simply the man who had not been there. He turned and walked slowly back to the car. His driver, a younger man named Marcus, who rarely spoke unless spoken to, opened the door for him without a word. Richard sat heavily, eyes fixed out the window as the trailer receded from view. The ride back was silent, and though the city gradually reclaimed its polish, gas stations turning into boutiques, chain restaurants giving way to art galleries and cafes, he felt none of it. The colors were muted, the life drained from every scene. At home, he declined dinner and went straight to his study. He closed the door behind him and stood for a long time before the fireplace, though there was no fire. The letter from Elizabeth still lay on the desk, a fragile thing now, weighted with new meaning. He picked it up, his thumb brushing over her signature. In her words, there had been hope, a small, desperate flicker. He had never answered her. And now, Naomi had answered him with a closed door. He sat down and opened a notebook. No longer trusting his voice, he tried instead to shape his thoughts on paper, but the words came slow and clumsy. How do you write to someone whose life you had helped shape only through absence? How do you speak of love when the one you had loved had died believing you didn't? The next morning, he rose early, driven not by restlessness but by something more urgent, responsibility. He had asked Denton to find Naomi, and Denton had done so with precision. But locating someone and understanding them were two different things entirely. He had seen her face now, had heard the steel in her voice. She knew who he was. That meant Elizabeth had spoken of him, spoken enough for Naomi to recognize him instantly. He asked Marcus to take him back. This time, he brought nothing with him. No gifts, no documents, no promises, just himself. The trailer park was quieter on a Sunday morning. A few children kicked a ball between gravel patches, and an elderly man hosed down his porch with careful effort. As the car came to a stop, Richard saw her before she saw him. She was hanging laundry, baby clothes, small shirts, and socks fluttering on the line. She wore jeans and a t-shirt, hair pulled back. The baby was asleep in a carrier strapped across her chest. When she turned and saw him, her eyes narrowed instantly. She stepped in front of the line, protective, her body instinctively shielding the child. "I told you not to come back," she said before he even approached. "I know," he replied, his voice quieter than he'd meant. "But I needed to." Naomi exhaled sharply, her jaw tightening. "What do you want from me?" "I want to talk," he said. "That's all." She hesitated. Her hand brushed over the baby's back in a slow, soothing motion. Then she turned slightly, nodding toward a broken lawn chair beside the trailer. "Talk, then." He moved to the chair, sitting carefully. It creaked under his weight. Naomi didn't sit. She remained standing, arms crossed, eyes locked on him. "I didn't know," he began, "about you, not until I saw that news segment. I found your mother's letter after all these years. I didn't open it. I wasn't ready. That's not an excuse, just the truth." She said nothing. "I know I hurt her," he continued, "and I know I hurt you, even before I knew you existed." Her gaze was steady, unreadable. "You didn't just hurt her, you erased her." The words hit him harder than he expected. He looked down at his hands, then back up. "I thought I was protecting something, family name, legacy, but I see now I was protecting fear. Fear of losing control, fear of change." Naomi's lips tightened. "My mother cried when she mailed that letter. She knew you wouldn't answer, but she wrote it anyway. She still hoped." "I know," he said quietly, "and I will carry that guilt for the rest of my life." For a moment, she looked away. The wind shifted the laundry beside them, and a child's sock brushed her arm. She didn't move. "I don't need your money," she said suddenly. "I didn't come with money." "No?" Her eyes narrowed again. "Then what are you offering? Regret? A late-stage revelation? What am I supposed to do with that?" He swallowed hard. "Nothing. You're not supposed to do anything. I came here because I needed to say it. I needed to acknowledge what I did. And if you don't want anything more from me, I'll never come back." She studied him for a long time. The baby shifted in the sling, murmured something soft. Naomi's hand went automatically to her daughter's head. "You didn't even come to the funeral," she said. "I didn't know when she died. You didn't care to know." He flinched but said nothing. She was right. I watched her die slowly, every week, less of her, and every week she still hoped you'd walk through the door. She made me promise, when she couldn't talk anymore, that I'd try to forgive you if I ever met you. She made me promise. So here I am, trying." Richard looked at her, at the strength it must have taken to raise a child alone, to work thankless jobs, to stand here now and face the man who had failed her and her mother both. "I don't deserve your forgiveness," he said. She didn't answer. Instead, she looked at him a moment longer, then down at her child. "I don't know if I can give it," she whispered, "but I haven't slammed the door this time. That's something." He nodded. "It is." They sat like that for a while, the laundry drying in the wind between them. No more words. Just the slow, difficult stillness that follows the first crack in a wall long built. Finally, Naomi said, "I have to put her down for a nap." He stood. Of course. She didn't invite him in, but she didn't ask him to leave and never return either. As he turned to go, she added, "If you come back, don't bring a suit, and don't come in a black car that costs more than this neighborhood." He almost smiled. Noted. That night, Richard sat again in his study, the fire lit now. For the first time in years, he didn't pour himself a drink. He simply sat and thought, the shadows dancing across the floor, and wondered how many visits it would take before Naomi believed he had come not to fix the past, but to witness it, truthfully, painfully, and fully. Richard returned home from the trailer park as the sun began its slow descent behind the hills, casting long shadows across the estate's vast manicured lawns. The house seemed even larger than usual that evening, as if the silence within it had expanded to fill every corner in response to his absence. The polished floors reflected the fading light. The air carried the faint scent of lemon polish and fresh-cut flowers, and yet there was something hollow in every surface, in every carefully placed object, as though the house itself had become a mausoleum for choices long buried and truths long denied. He stood for a long time at the top of the stairs, gazing down at the gallery of family portraits lining the hallway. Oil paintings of men in waistcoats and women in lace, generations of Lawrences captured in poses of deliberate elegance. None of them smiled. None of them had lived beyond the rigid roles assigned to them by their time. They had built legacies of wealth and control, of land and title. But Richard wondered now what had been sacrificed in the name of those legacies, how much love had been smothered under propriety, how many voices had been silenced for the sake of appearance. That night, sleep did not come easily. When it did, it brought with it strange dreams. He saw Elizabeth as a child again, running barefoot through the garden, her hair wild in the wind. She turned to look at him, her face radiant with joy, but behind her the garden dissolved into concrete, her laughter fading into the cry of a baby. Then there was Naomi, standing beside a crib, her back to him, her shoulders tense. He called out to her, but she didn't turn. The baby cried louder. He reached out, but his hand passed through them like mist. In the morning, he rose with a sense of determination. He had seen the edge of Naomi's world, but only from the outside. If he was ever to truly understand what she faced, what his daughter had faced before her, he would need to step into that world and live in it, even briefly, not as an observer behind tinted glass, not as a benefactor at arm's length, but as a man willing to see and listen. He asked Bernard to clear his schedule. No meetings, no calls. He dressed in plain clothes, left his watch behind, and told Marcus to drop him off not at the trailer park, but several blocks away. He wanted to walk. He wanted to feel the weight of the city around him, the way Naomi did each day. The neighborhood was a mix of sagging structures and defiant color. Faded murals of civil rights leaders and saints adorned walls above boarded-up storefronts. Children played on sidewalks cracked like old pottery. Women swept porches and watched the street with eyes sharpened by years of alertness. The air smelled of oil, dust, and the faint perfume of frying food from corner kitchens. Richard walked with hands in his pockets, head slightly bowed, feeling like an intruder in a place where survival was an art form passed down through generations. He visited the diner where Naomi worked her morning shift. He didn't enter. He watched from across the street as she moved between tables, balancing trays and smiling when she could. The smile was tired, but it was real. He noted the way her posture straightened when her manager passed by, the way she avoided lingering too long in any one spot. The tips were small, the pace relentless. He stayed for over an hour, unnoticed, before moving on. Next, he walked to the community center Naomi sometimes mentioned in passing during their brief conversations. It was a repurposed church building, its paint peeling but its spirit intact. He stepped inside hesitantly and was greeted by the noise of children, the shuffle of paperwork, the murmur of exhausted voices asking for help with rent, food stamps, job referrals. A woman behind the desk glanced up wary. "I'm not here for assistance," Richard said quickly. "I just wanted to understand what this place is." She looked at him for a long moment before nodding. "It's where people come when they run out of options." "Do people like Naomi Lawrence come here?" The woman raised an eyebrow. "You a reporter?" "No." "Family?" "Yes," he said. "I didn't used to be, but I'm trying to be." She considered that, then gestured toward the main hall. "Then look around. Maybe you'll learn something." Richard walked slowly through the space. A toddler tugged at his mother's skirt. A young man in a wheelchair spoke in hushed tones with a social worker. A bulletin board listed free meal hours, job training workshops, and open court dates for housing disputes. Everything smelled of floor cleaner and old carpet. It was not a place of despair, but a place of fight. A place where people came not to surrender, but to cling to what dignity they could. Outside again, he passed a small park where a group of teenagers sat on swings, their conversation laced with sarcasm and steel. They watched him with guarded curiosity. He didn't linger. He understood the weight of his skin, his age, his presence. He had never thought much about such things before. But now he did. Over the next few days, he returned to these streets again and again. He stopped at the local grocery store Naomi frequented, watched as mothers counted coupons, as food stamps were swiped with embarrassment. He rode the bus line that stopped near her trailer, sitting beside a mother with 2 crying children, across from a man in a maintenance uniform asleep against the window. He went to the laundromat, the pharmacy, the daycare center. Each place told a part of Naomi's story. A story he had never imagined. A story Elizabeth must have lived quietly, painfully, until the very end. One afternoon, he found himself sitting outside the daycare, watching as Naomi arrived to pick up Abigail. The little girl toddled toward her mother, arms outstretched, and Naomi scooped her up with a soft laugh. It was a sound he hadn't heard before. Not in person, not even in Elizabeth. He approached carefully, not wanting to startle her. She turned, surprised, but didn't frown. "You've been following me?" she asked. "No," he said, "learning." She didn't respond, but she didn't walk away either. "I went to the community center," he said. "The diner. I rode the bus." Her eyes widened slightly. "You, on the 52 route?" He nodded. "It broke down. I had to wait 40 minutes in the rain." She laughed, and though it was short, it was real. "Now you know why we're always late," she said. "I had no idea," he said. "None of it. I was blind. Or maybe I chose not to look." Naomi adjusted Abigail on her hip. "A lot of people choose not to look. It's easier that way. I can't fix everything," he said, "but I want to help, if you'll let me, not with checks or trust funds, with time, understanding." Naomi studied him, eyes narrowed against the sun. "Understanding is a start," she said, "but that takes more than a bus ride." "I'm here," he said, "for as long as it takes." She nodded slowly, then turned to walk toward the trailer, her daughter clinging to her shirt. Richard followed, several paces behind, not yet family, but no longer a stranger. That night, he sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the framed photograph of Elizabeth he had moved to his nightstand. He traced her face with a trembling finger, not in sadness alone, but in reverence. For the life she had carved from stone, for the daughter she had raised with grace, for the granddaughter she had left as both a wound and a bridge. A world he had never known had opened before him, and he had finally stepped inside. The air inside the trailer was hot and still, the old ceiling fan spinning lazily, pushing more dust than breeze. Naomi sat on the edge of the fold-out couch, elbows on her knees, head bowed. Her apron was still tied around her waist, smudged with ketchup, coffee stains, and exhaustion. Abigail was asleep in the small bedroom she had converted from a closet, no bigger than a pantry, barely large enough to fit the crib she'd found secondhand on the curb last winter. Naomi had scrubbed the bars clean with bleach and lined the inside with a quilt her mother had sewn years ago. That quilt had once lived on their couch, then on her bed, and now cushioned her daughter's dreams. But tonight, dreams felt like a luxury. The electricity had been cut off again, and the temperature outside was climbing. She had just enough left in her checking account to cover either the power or the daycare bill, never both, and now she was out of time. She rose slowly and walked to the counter, opened the drawer where she kept bills folded neatly with sticky notes attached. There was one marked urgent, final notice, and she stared at it until the letters blurred. She didn't cry. She rarely did anymore. Her tears had dried up sometime between her third double shift and the day her WIC card got declined in front of a line of strangers. She was bone tired, not just from work, but from surviving. The kind of tired that settled in your soul and made even breathing feel heavy. She pulled out her phone and opened the calendar. Her schedule was a mess. Her morning shift at the diner had just been cut from 5 days to 3. Her cleaning job was on call, and with a new supervisor in charge, her hours had been steadily disappearing. The daycare had warned her that if she missed another payment, they would have to give the spot to another child. Abigail couldn't stay there on kindness alone. She thought of her mother, of the way Elizabeth had never complained, not once, even as her body wasted away under hospital lights. Naomi had watched her mother suffer quietly, pride intact to the bitter end. Elizabeth had taught her that silence was strength, that asking for help was a last resort, and that family was a bond you protected even if it didn't protect you back. It was why Naomi had closed the door in Richard's face that first time. It was why she had let him talk the second time, but never let him in. But he had come back, again and again. Not always with words, sometimes just with his presence. He had sat beside her on the park bench while Abigail played with a stick and a juice box. He had helped her carry groceries when her back ached from lifting trays all morning. He didn't offer money anymore, not directly. Instead, he asked questions. He listened. He remembered. Still, she didn't know what to do with him. And tonight, she didn't know what to do with her life. Her phone buzzed on the counter, breaking the silence. A message from her supervisor. "Your shift tomorrow is canceled. We're overstaffed. Sorry." She dropped the phone. It bounced off the counter and hit the floor, skidding to a stop beneath the kitchen table. She stared at it for a moment, then slid to her knees, picking it up with numb fingers. She held it tightly, knuckles white. A tremor passed through her, but she suppressed it. Then the lights flickered and died. The trailer fell into darkness. She sat there on the linoleum, barely breathing, Abigail's soft sighs filtering in from the back room. The silence roared. The walls pressed in. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory. "You're strong, baby. Stronger than I ever was." She didn't feel strong. She felt like a breaking glass. The next morning, she wrapped Abigail in a light blanket and walked the 3 blocks to the daycare to explain. The director, a kind woman with tired eyes, offered to keep Abigail for the morning. Just this once, no charge. Naomi thanked her without emotion, kissed her daughter's forehead, and stepped back out into the rising heat. Her body moved on autopilot. She didn't know where she was going. She just walked. Her feet led her to the community center, though it wasn't a place she liked to visit unless she had to. It always smelled like paperwork and weary hope. She sat in the waiting area, filled out another form, added her name to the sign-in sheet. The clerk at the desk looked up and said, "We'll call you soon." But Naomi knew better than to wait for miracles. She folded the paperwork and left it on the counter. She was walking down the street when she saw him. Richard. He was exiting the same grocery store she had been too ashamed to enter that morning, pushing a cart filled not with fine wine or imported cheeses, but with ordinary food. Bread, milk, apples, baby formula. He didn't see her at first. His back was slightly stooped, his white shirt wrinkled, his expression preoccupied. There was something different about him now. The smooth armor of wealth had worn thin around the edges. He looked older, but not fragile, just human. She didn't know what compelled her to call out. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was the unbearable heat. Maybe it was the way the bag of formula in his cart reminded her that she had used the last scoop the night before. Richard. He turned, his eyes lit up with surprise, then concern. He took a step toward her, then hesitated. "I lost my job," she said flatly. He blinked. "The diner?" She nodded. "Cutbacks, and the cleaning service doesn't have any hours for me. I haven't paid the electricity bill. Daycare's about to drop Abigail, and I don't know what I'm doing anymore." She didn't mean to say all of it, not like that. But once the words began, they poured out like floodwater breaching a dam. She wasn't asking for pity. She wasn't even asking for help. She just needed someone to hear her. Richard said nothing for a moment. Then he took a small step closer and asked gently, "Can I walk you home?" She considered saying no, but her legs ached and her throat was dry. She nodded. They walked side by side, slowly, past faded storefronts and cracked sidewalks. He carried the bag of groceries in one hand. She walked with her arms folded, more out of habit than defense. When they reached the trailer, she unlocked the door and gestured for him to come in. The space was dim, stuffy from the heat. He didn't comment. He placed the groceries on the counter and stood quietly. She sat at the edge of the couch, leaned forward, and buried her face in her hands. Her voice was muffled when she spoke. "Do you know what it's like to work yourself to the bone and still fall behind? To stand in line for help you know they won't give? To hold your baby and wonder if she'd be better off with someone else?" He sat beside her, not too close. "No," he said softly, "I don't. But I want to understand." She raised her head, eyes red but dry. "Then listen." And he did. She told him about the time she walked 5 miles in the snow to get formula because the buses had shut down. She told him about watching her mother die slowly, in pieces. About the night Abigail had a fever, and she sat up for 9 hours with a wet rag, whispering lullabies in the dark. About the customer at the diner who grabbed her wrist too tightly, and the manager who told her to smile more. About the job interviews where she never got called back, and the housing office that lost her paperwork 3 times. He listened. He didn't interrupt. When she finished, she sat back, spent. "I'm not asking for a miracle," she said. "I'm just tired. I need room to breathe." Richard looked at her for a long time. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded envelope. Not cash, a letter. "I wrote this last night," he said. "I didn't know if I should give it to you, but maybe now's the time." She took it, opened it. The letter was short. A promise, not a transaction. He would support her with childcare costs, no strings attached. He would cover the electric bill for good, not as charity, not as guilt, but as a first step towards building something that should have existed all along: family. Naomi folded the letter carefully, slowly. "I'll think about it," she said. "That's all I ask." Later, as he stood to leave, Abigail stirred in her sleep. Naomi walked to the back room to check on her. Richard paused in the doorway, watching mother and child silhouetted in the fading afternoon light. Naomi turned. "You're not forgiven," she said. "I know," he replied, "but maybe, one day." She didn't smile, but she didn't close the door behind him. Outside, the sun dipped below the horizon, and for the first time in a long while, Naomi felt something like air returning to her lungs. The wall hadn't come down. Not yet, but a single brick had been lifted. The letter Richard had given Naomi remained on her kitchen counter for 3 days, untouched but not forgotten. Each morning she glanced at it, and each night she considered reading it again, though she already knew it by heart. The words had not been particularly poetic. They hadn't needed to be. They had been clear, steady, and unembellished. A promise to help, not as a savior, but as someone finally willing to shoulder responsibility. Still, Naomi hesitated. For all her frustration, for all the times she had whispered angry things to the ceiling while rocking Abigail in the dark, she had never allowed herself to hope that anyone would step in, not even her grandfather. Especially not him. It wasn't that she didn't want his help. It was that she didn't know how to receive it without wondering what it might cost. Even if he said there were no strings, even if he claimed he didn't want anything in return, she had lived long enough in a world where every gesture had its underside. Nothing was free, especially not for women like her. But the truth was, she was running out of options. The daycare had granted her a brief extension, but it was clear from the director's tone that they couldn't hold the spot indefinitely. Her power had been restored thanks to an anonymous payment, which she knew had come from Richard. And the envelope had also contained a separate note, a contact at a local businesswoman's cooperative, a woman named Clarisse Bowen, who offered mentorship and professional development for working mothers. Naomi didn't know if she was ready for that kind of leap. She'd been surviving for so long, the idea of building something felt distant and unreal. But still, she called. Clarisse had a warm voice, direct and no nonsense. They met in a corner cafe near the co-op's office. Clarisse had coffee waiting for her, asked smart questions, and didn't blink when Naomi admitted she hadn't finished college and hadn't had a proper resume in years. She listened carefully, as if Naomi were pitching a business rather than her own exhausted self. By the end of the hour, Naomi had a plan. Small, but real. They'd start with the part-time administrative work, shadowing Clarisse's assistant. If it worked out, Clarisse would train her to manage small projects. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't easy, but it was a door, and Naomi was ready to knock. Richard heard about the meeting from Clarisse 2 days later. He had made it clear to her. No special treatment. No stepping in if Naomi faltered. He didn't want to orchestrate Naomi's success. He just wanted to clear the wreckage that had blocked her path. He began to visit less frequently, sensing that his constant presence might be more suffocating than supportive. When he did visit, he brought books for Abigail, or groceries, or a simple bag of diapers. Never anything flashy, never anything that suggested obligation. He sat on the trailer steps and watched Abigail waddle between them, her curls bouncing with each uncertain step. Naomi had softened, slowly, around the edges. She didn't smile often, but she no longer tensed when he approached. Their conversations became longer, less guarded. She asked about Elizabeth once, quietly, while slicing vegetables for dinner. He told her stories. Not all of them flattering, but all of them true. One evening, as they sat outside watching the sky blush into twilight, Naomi said, "I don't think she would have believed this." "She didn't believe I'd ever change," he replied. "I didn't believe it either." Naomi considered that. "So why now?" "Because I finally saw what I refused to look at. You, her, all of it." She didn't answer, but she didn't look away either. Back at his estate, Richard faced a very different storm. Word of his involvement with Naomi had begun to circulate, quietly at first, then with increasing clarity. Some of his business partners, old and conservative, raised eyebrows during board meetings. One long-standing investor requested a private conversation and expressed concern about the optics of Richard's new affiliations. Another reminded him delicately that family matters should remain private, especially when they drew attention to complicated dynamics. The worst of it came when the chairman of a national trade consortium called Richard directly. "We're hearing chatter," the man said. "You're aligning yourself with a girl who's never even had a college degree. And well, she's not exactly what your brand represents. It's not good for the firm." Richard had listened without responding. When the call ended, he poured himself a glass of water and stared at the glass doors that opened to his empty garden. Then he made a decision. 2 days later, he called a press conference. The room was filled with reporters expecting a corporate announcement, perhaps a merger, perhaps a new philanthropic initiative. Instead, Richard stood before the podium, a modest gray suit on his aging frame, and spoke not of business, but of family. "I'm here today to speak of something more personal than stocks or dividends," he began. "For years I lived behind walls I helped build. I called them tradition, reputation, legacy, but they were fear, pride, and ignorance. I lost my daughter to those walls. I nearly lost my granddaughter. I'm here because I will not lose her now. I have a granddaughter. Her name is Naomi. She's brilliant, she is strong, and she has endured more than most people can imagine. She is not a charity case. She is not a liability. She is my family." The room was silent. "I will not apologize for that, and I will not do business with those who ask me to." The press printed it in bold headlines. Some called it an act of courage, others called it a calculated move from a man with one foot in retirement. A few commentators on late-night television made jokes. But Naomi read the transcript in full. She didn't tell Richard she had read it. She didn't have to. The next time he came over, she handed him Abigail without hesitation. That was answer enough. As the weeks passed, Naomi found her rhythm. Clarice began assigning her more tasks. She shadowed meetings, took notes, coordinated schedules. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was steady. She printed her resume for the first time in years and submitted it to 2 other organizations. One replied. She scheduled an interview, showed up in pressed slacks and a borrowed blazer, and answered questions clearly and without apology. She didn't get the job, but she didn't break. Richard watched all of it from a respectful distance. He offered encouragement, but never control. When Naomi asked for advice, he gave it plainly. When she didn't, he remained silent. Their relationship began to take on the shape of something almost ordinary. A shared meal here, a quiet afternoon there, stories swapped, mistakes acknowledged. One night, Naomi invited him to dinner, not at the trailer, but at Clarice's co-op, where a few of the women hosted potlucks every month. Richard arrived, awkward in the fluorescent lighting, and found himself seated between a retired nurse and a high school counselor. They asked him polite questions, then harder ones. He answered all of them honestly. By the end of the evening, he was laughing over sweet potato pie while Abigail napped in a folding chair nearby. Later, walking Naomi and Abigail home beneath the street lamps, Richard said, "That was humbling." She smiled faintly. "That's the point." They paused outside the trailer. She didn't invite him in, but she didn't turn away. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For not giving up." "I gave up once," he said. "I won't do it again." Naomi nodded. Then, in a moment that surprised them both, she leaned forward and hugged him. It wasn't long or tight, but it was real. When she stepped back, she said, "Good night, Grandpa." He stood there for a long time after the door closed. In his car on the ride home, he looked out the window, his reflection overlaying the passing streetlights. So much had changed, and so much still could. The summer sun hung heavy over the trailer park, casting long shadows across the gravel paths and faded doorsteps. Naomi stood outside her home, one hand shading her eyes as she watched Abigail totter unsteadily between the dandelions that poked through cracks in the concrete. The toddler's laughter rang out like music, unbothered by the world's weight, as if joy were something instinctive, something too young to fear scarcity. Naomi smiled and crouched to gather her daughter in her arms, lifting her with ease and pressing her cheek to the child's temple. Abigail's skin was warm, her breath sweet with juice and crackers. For a long moment, Naomi simply held her, rocking side to side with no real rhythm, a silence between them thick with peace. A breeze stirred the trees at the edge of the lot, and Naomi glanced up the road just in time to see Richard's sedan pull into view. It wasn't the same sleek black vehicle he had once arrived in, the one that had made neighbors stare and whisper. This one was modest, a beige four-door that blended in with the world around it. Richard stepped out slowly, a paper bag in one hand, and smiled as he caught sight of them. He walked without hurry, dressed in khakis and a rolled-up shirt, sleeves pushed past his elbows, the silver of his hair catching the sun like a crown he no longer cared to polish. Naomi waved and met him halfway, Abigail squealing at the sight of her grandfather. Richard handed her the bag, filled with groceries from the farmer's market: eggs, apples, and a jar of local honey. Naomi accepted it with a nod, and together they walked toward the trailer. Inside, the small space had been transformed since that first afternoon he had stepped through its door. It was still cramped, still modest, but now it felt like a home. The curtains were new, sewn by Naomi herself from fabric she'd bought on sale. The floors had been cleaned and re-waxed, and a shelf in the corner held children's books, framed photos, and a small potted plant Abigail had taken to watering with a teaspoon every morning. They sat together over a simple lunch: grilled cheese sandwiches, carrot sticks, and lemonade. Abigail chattered constantly, offering them both bits of sandwich she'd already bitten into. Naomi listened with a kind of amused patience, her hand resting lightly on her daughter's back. Richard watched them both with quiet gratitude. Moments like this had once felt impossible. Now they felt sacred. When Abigail was finally asleep, sprawled across the couch with a picture book on her chest, Naomi stepped out onto the steps and Richard followed. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the sounds of lawnmowers and passing cars, until Naomi turned to him. "She said your name this morning," she said. "Did she?" he asked, his smile soft. "She said, 'Grandpa's car go vroom.'" Then she clapped. He chuckled, pride flickering across his face like sunlight on water. "She's got good instincts." Naomi laughed, then grew quiet. "She's going to grow up knowing you," she said. "That means something." He didn't respond right away. Instead, he looked out at the sky, where clouds were slowly drifting, changing shape by the minute. "Do you ever think about what you're leaving behind?" she asked. "Every day," he said. "I used to think legacy was something rich people worried about, something carved into buildings or sewn into bank accounts. But lately, I've been thinking it's smaller than that. Maybe it's just what survives you. The stories people tell when you're gone, the kindness you leave behind." Richard's voice was steady. "For a long time I thought legacy was control. Now I know it's love." She glanced at him, her eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "That's a pretty good line. Did you come up with that?" "No," he said, "but I lived it." He told her then about the board meeting, about the investors who had left, the projects that had dissolved overnight. He didn't speak of them with bitterness, only resignation. Some losses were necessary. Others were cleansing. "They said aligning myself with you would hurt the brand," he said. But the truth is, the brand hurt itself long before you ever came into it. Naomi's mouth twisted slightly. They didn't like the optics. No, he said, but they never really looked at me either. Not the real me. She nodded. That's the thing about people like us. They see us how they want, not how we are. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small envelope. What's this? She asked, eyeing it with suspicion. My will, he said, or rather, the new one. She blinked. You brought your will to lunch? I wanted you to see it, he said simply. You don't have to sign anything. I'm not asking you to. But you're in it now. Not just you, but Abigail. Not because I think you need it, because it's right. She turned the envelope over in her hands, but didn't open it. I don't want your guilt, she said. This isn't guilt, he replied. It's acknowledgement, and maybe one day a bridge. She held the envelope a moment longer, then tucked it into the pocket of her jeans. I'll read it later. They sat in silence again, the air between them calmer now, the past no longer pressing down with the same weight. A week later, Naomi received a letter in the mail addressed to Miss Naomi Lawrence, in a careful, feminine script. Inside was an invitation to speak at a local panel for working mothers, organized by Clarice's co-op. They wanted Naomi to talk about her experience balancing parenthood and work, about resilience and dignity. She almost declined. Then, after putting Abigail to sleep, she sat at the kitchen table and drafted an outline. She didn't have a college degree. She didn't have a polished story, but she had something to say. At the panel, she wore a blue blouse and black slacks and spoke without notes. She told the truth. She spoke of fear, of exhaustion, of being invisible. She spoke of pride, of finding her voice. She didn't mention Richard by name, but when she spoke of learning to accept help without shame, she thought of him. Afterward, 2 women approached her with tears in their eyes. One said, "You told my story." The other simply said, "Thank you." That night, Naomi came home and found Richard waiting on the steps, a small bag of groceries beside him. "How did it go?" he asked. She sat down beside him, resting her head against the railing. "It was good," she said. "Hard, but good." He nodded. "That's how you know it matters." Abigail woke early the next morning, bounding from her crib with a stuffed bear in one hand and her thumb in her mouth. Naomi pulled her into her lap and opened the curtains. Outside, the sun was rising slow and golden, spreading over the rooftops like a promise. Later that week, Naomi framed a photo of her mother, the one she kept tucked in her wallet, and hung it on the wall above the kitchen table. She placed it between a picture of Abigail and a photograph Clarice had taken of Naomi speaking at the panel. She didn't say anything to Richard about it, but the next time he came over, he noticed, and he stood before it quietly for a long time. "She'd be proud of you," he said. "She'd be proud of you, too," Naomi replied. He turned to her, eyes glassy. "Thank you," he whispered. The sun shifted in the window. Outside, children's voices floated on the breeze, and the sound of a distant ice cream truck played a tune from another era. Life was not perfect. The world was still unfair. But in that small kitchen, something had been mended. Legacy was not marble and nameplates. It was this: the child in the crib, the woman at the stove, the man who had once been lost and who had finally been found. If you found this story meaningful, make sure to subscribe for more. Check out the next video and others on the channel. And don't forget to share this one with someone who needs to hear it.